Hello, and welcome to Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project, an initiative by Bangladesh Feminist Archives. I'm Tanvir Anoy, an academic author, archivist, and activist, and I'm honored to host today's conversation. This project is dedicated to preserving the voices of feminists who have shaped and continue to shape movements for gender justice in Bangladesh and beyond. Through these conversations, we aim to document their personal journeys, struggles, and contributions to feminist movements, ensuring that these histories are archived for future generations. For this third episode, we are delighted to feature Nafisa Nipun Tanjeem, an associate professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at Worcester State University in Massachusetts, USA. Nafisa's research and teaching focus on transnational, postcolonial, and decolonial feminisms, critical race theory, and social justice movements. Beyond academia, Nafisa is actively involved in feminist organizing. She is an organizer for Meye Network and Feminist Alliance of Bangladesh FAB, two grassroots feminist platforms advocating for solidarity and activism in Bangladesh and among the Bangladeshi diaspora. Today, Nafisa will share her journey, reflections on transnational feminism, and her vision for feminist activism in Bangladesh and beyond. Sorry. It would be her vision for feminist activism in Bangladesh and beyond. So, Nafisa, let's start with your personal journey. What led you to feminist activism and research? Were there particular experiences or influences that shaped your commitment to transnational feminism?
Hi, Ono. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to join this initiative and share my experience. So, yes, I can talk a little bit about my journey into the academia and activism, and also talk about how I came into this whole feminist thing. So, I grew up in Bangladesh, Dhaka to be specific, in a middle class to some extent very traditional family setting. And I would say my first feminist consciousness arose when I think I was about 11 and my mom was pregnant with my third sister. And as you know very well, son preference is very prevalent in Bangladesh. So when my mom was pregnant, most of the relatives around me started talking about, oh, if you can have a son, what an amazing thing it would be. And then there were, things that people were coming up with. If you do this, then you might have a son. And I was listening to those conversations. And as an 11-year-old, it was mind blowing to think about how me and my sisters, we are not enough for our parents. And I asked those questions to my parents. I'm like, why do you have to another baby? Are we not enough? And then our relatives try to make me understand that, oh, if you have a brother, this brother is going to protect you in this society. And it's really a dangerous society for, women. And you won't even be able to inherit all the property from your parents. If you have a brother, the property would stay within your family. So I would say to some extent that was my first feminist lesson in a way that I just couldn't accept what was presented to me in terms of, why I would need a baby brother to protect me and why I wouldn't be able to inherit my parents' property. So I started asking those questions. Then I was also approaching my puberty, and I realized that, just because my body was changing, I had to drastically change the attire that I was wearing. My mobility got affected. I was no longer allowed to play outside. And also, I was not allowed to hang out with boys. So all these boundaries were being drawn. And that gave me this, painful consciousness that actually growing up as a young girl in this society, I mean, it's a painful thing. It's a challenging thing. So when I finished my high school and went to college, my dad did a really good thing. He brought me syllabi from different departments. Most of the departments had a curriculum book where they outlined all the courses that they offered. So I'm glad that my parents offered me that choice. My dad brought syllabi from anthropology, communications, English, law, you name it, like all the departments. He knew a few friends at the university, so he managed to collect the syllabi. And then I took a look, and this syllabi from the Department of Women and Gender Studies just grabbed my attention. I was going through all the courses, and I was like, oh, it's actually talking about me. And then I just decided to study this. And it's interesting that, I mean, obviously there was this life experience component, but also I'm fortunate enough to study feminism in an academic setting. I finished my undergrad. And I guess in my undergrad level, my feminism was very much focused on the individual experience. It was about, oh, men and women have to be equal. And mind you, I'm saying men and women. So it was about equality. It's about, being equal to men. And that understanding of feminism changed when I migrated to North America. I was fortunate enough to secure a fellowship at the University of Toronto for my master's in women and gender studies. In Bangladesh, although I grew up in a middle class family, I had a lot of privileges. I had two parents, both parents were working full time. So we're not rich, but also I didn't have to struggle for food or, addressing basic necessities of my life. I grew up in a Muslim family. I am a Bengali, so I had all the majoritarian privileges in Bangladesh. But then after moving to Canada, I suddenly realized that everything changed. I couldn't identify myself as a middle class person. My monthly stipend was $1,200, and I had to use $1,200 to pay all kinds of bills in Toronto, which was a very expensive city. And I started going to what they call free store in my local community where people used to donate utensils and clothes and, everyday necessities. And those things were free. So I remember there's one day I got a few utensils and some winter clothes from the free store. And I called my mom and I showed my winter clothes. I was very excited that, oh, I mean, I got those expensive clothes for free. And my mom was so sad. And she was like, so now you're wearing second-hand clothes. So that was a blow to her and also to some extent a new realization for me that, okay, so I don't have my class privilege anymore. And I went to grad school in a post 9/11 context. It was 2008, and anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant hate was there. Like if you just say that, oh, I'm Muslim, people would look at you. And I had people, like well-meaning, liberal white people coming to me and asking like really weird questions about, oh, your religion is really oppressive, right? It's really horrible to be a Muslim woman. How do you feel about those things? I mean, I was like, it's complicated, right? I mean, I grew up as a Muslim woman, but also, like I said, I had the majoritarian privileges. So you need to take a look at the intersection and not just focus on one specific thing. And then I also had to kind of navigate my citizenship status. I was an international student in Canada, and then I was also an international student in the United States for 7 years. And then I had what they call OPT, kind of transitioning between student and, working full time. Finally, I was able to secure my green card. So navigating the excruciating immigration process, I was fortunate enough there was a pathway, but also the amount of, paperwork and the uncertainty. And every time you submit an application, you don't necessarily know that you're going to get approved. And then, facing visa interviews all the time. So anyways, I guess my experience in Canada and North America gave me an embodied experience of how it feels to be someone from a minoritized community. And that I would say drastically shaped my understanding about feminism. So my feminism was no longer about equality between men and women. I didn't want to be equal to men. And I learned to question intersections of oppressive systems. I learned to question, the immigration system. I learned to question imperialism. I learned to question capitalism and how all these different oppressive systems interact with each other and then create and sustain hostile environment for people specifically who are coming from different marginalized communities. And I would say that experience of, being an immigrant to some extent, being someone from different kinds of minoritized communities, I feel like it made me more empathetic. It made me want to engage in struggles that are intersectional in nature and that are more focused on challenging systems rather than achieving symbolic equality.
Thank you so much, Professor Nafisa. That was really, really, really nice to hear from you about your personal journey. Um, that childhood story really, really, I would say, a little bit broke my heart. But that's the reality in Bangladesh, and that's not a really uncommon story, right? So I would miss it would be lying if I say that like, oh, I'm very shocked, but no, it's a regular story in a regular Bangladeshi household, right? So my next question to you would be, looking back on your journey so far, how have your personal experiences influenced your work, I would say, as both an activist and an academic?
That's a great question. I would say when I was in Bangladesh, focused on getting good grades, and I was so much dedicated. I loved what I studied, but I was very much dedicated about being a professor at the University of Dhaka. So it was about, oh, I mean, you have to be the top one in your class. It was all about okay, get good grades, get good grades, and to some extent, although I started questioning social norms. I wanted to subscribe consciously or unconsciously. Maybe I was just programmed to do it, to subscribe to this ideal mood of, being a good student in Bangladesh, which meant, I wouldn't get involved in politics. I wouldn't get involved in organizing. I would just focus on my studies and get good grades. So that's what I did when I was in Dhaka studying at the University of Dhaka. But then I moved to North America, and like I said, because of my embedded, intersectional experiences, I feel like I gained, the language to name this experience, and also started getting involved with different kinds of grassroots organizing. I started working with it was a community organizing initiative that used to work with undocumented immigrants in Canada. And then I worked with a nonprofit organization for a while. It's called Council of Agencies serving South Asians. So my role was it was the role of a community organizer. I used to go to different South Asian communities and work on issues like education and health and youth engagement. So that broadened my perspective, and I was able to understand what it means by building solidarity with grassroots communities. Like, what exactly does it mean by grassroots? And also, what are the challenges that you face when you are working through an NGOized model? I was part of a nonprofit organization. We had lots of restrictions about funding. A significant amount of our funding used to come from the Immigration Authority of Canada. It was a government funding. So at one point, very naively, I asked my executive director, like, can I invite that organizer who works on undocumented immigration and specifically supports work labor rights of undocumented immigrants. And my executive director just smiled at me and she's like, Nafisa, you can invite all other people that you want to, except for this one, because we work with government funding. So I feel like on one hand, I was slowly getting introduced to grassroots community organizing, but I also started learning about the obstacles, the institutional obstacles that make it really difficult. When I moved to the United States for my PhD in women and gender studies, I became part of an effort called United Students Against Sweatshop. It's they have many at that time. They probably had more than 150 student chapters in U.S. universities, and that was the year when the Rana Plaza collapse happened. So United Students Against Sweatshop, USAS in abbreviation, they started working on a campaign called Garment Worker Solidarity. And I was very disturbed by what happened in Bangladesh. I just started working on my dissertation, and I wanted to study how labor organizing works in the US and Bangladesh, and specifically what organizers can do to prevent catastrophic human-made disasters like the Rana Plaza collapse. So I started working with this local group that was very passionate about ensuring, global solidarity. I was very much into this garment worker solidarity campaign, like did a bunch of, sit-ins, protests, flash mobs. I was doing everything. But interestingly, one of the turning points in my work is where I worked with that organization for about a year, and then I came to Bangladesh to do my PhD fieldwork. And I remember the very first day of going for my ethnography. I was doing an ethnography of a rally organized by some local activist groups. And they were specifically working with the survivors of the Tajwin factory fire. So I met one of the local activists and explained that, I'm studying in the US, working on my PhD, and we are advocating for this global campaign called
Professor
Accord for Equity.
Nafisa, can you a little bit explain on the so you said Tajrin fire? Can you
Tajwin factory fire. Mhm.
expand on that? Like what is Tajrin factory fire? So
Sure.
our
It
viewers would
was a
have like
huge
a
factory
yeah.
fire that happened in November 2012, killing more than 100 people. And some people said maybe 112, 30, but yeah, more than 100 people. And it precisely happened because the fire started and all the emergency exits were locked because the factory owner and manager just thought that, workers were going to steal pieces of clothes. So people couldn't exit. And
It
then some of
happened before Rana Plaza or
before Rana Plaza, precisely 6 months before the Rana Plaza
okay,
collapse.
great.
I
Yes.
was a really bad time, right? I mean, I was observing all this like horrible human-made disasters happening one after another, and I really wanted to do something. So yeah, thanks for asking for the clarification. So I was meeting the Tazreen factory fire survivors in Dhaka and also talking to an activist. And I was, this young grad student and super excited about my PhD work. And I was like, my PhD work is going to change the world. And, I'm going to, I don't know, invent this novel theory of labor organizing. So I was super excited. And I met this local organizer and explained that, oh, we have been organizing for promoting Accord for building and fire safety in Bangladesh. And Accord is great because da 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 da, it's going to put pressure on global brands to ensure that Bangladeshi factories are safe. And then the activist just looked at me and literally said, do you know what the hell you're talking about? I mean, this accord is creating so much problem at the local level. I was like, what do you mean? And then she went and on and on and started talking about how accord is promoting is it's promoting it was promoting a very technocratic definition of building on fire safety, undermining series of local organizing initiatives that were tried to address things like raising minimum wage and ensuring job security, addressing sexual harassment on floor, ensuring compensation for survivors of different industrial disasters and things like that, reviewing and updating labor laws. And the activist was like, we're trying to address those core systemic things, but all the funds are like all the funders and big NGOs are asking you to work on building and fire safety. And it's just not enough. Like you can have safe buildings, but you also need to take care of the people who work in those buildings. So I guess that was like an aha moment for my research. And going back to your question about how, my research and my, like activism kind of shape what I do. So my PhD research took a very different turn. Like when I met that activist and I started kind of digging further to get a sense of, these junctures of transnational solidarity building. And sometimes it's really easy to come up with a romanticized understanding of transnational solidarity buildings. And they're like, oh, there'll be South-South coalitions and we're going to change systems of oppression. But I guess as I started to kind of find out all these really nuanced complexities of relationships, complexities of transnational solidarity building, it motivated me more and more to dive deeper into not only the amazing things about transnational solidarity building, but also the loopholes, the complexities, the discontents of transnational solidarity building. So, I mean, that's what I have been doing, I guess, since I've finished my PhD. Right now, I'm working as a college professor, and the classes I teach, most of my classes have a very strong focus on transnational organizing, and it's all about how we can challenge intersecting systems of oppression. So I, on the very first day of my women's gender sexuality studies class, I tried to clarify that we are not here to achieve some kind of equality with this white heterosexual Christian cis man. We are here to challenge intersecting systems of oppression. and the grassroots organizing that I do in my various capacities. I have a long history of working with faculty union at a college campus. I'm involved with the Faculty for Justice in Palestine here in the United States. I am also involved with two other nonprofit, not exactly nonprofit, community organizing initiatives in Bangladesh, Bangladesh, and Feminist Alliance of Bangladesh. I have volunteered with a garment workers organization called Bangladesh Garment Shramik Sanghuti. And in my work, I always try to be mindful about the social location I occupy. I feel like my border crossing experience is extremely valuable because I feel like because of my cross border lives in Bangladesh and the United States, I feel like I'm able to see things from like a perspective that is not bounded by a nation state. But also I have to be very mindful about the fact that in Bangladesh, I don't live in Bangladesh, I visit Bangladesh, so I'm someone who's kind of from the United States. So I try to be mindful about the fact that I just don't use my like US privilege to impose something and just tell organizers that what, I'm a college professor, so let me tell you how to organize at the grassroots. I try not to do that thing. I try to be a good listener and just ask them, like, do you need me to do anything? And if you need me, I'll try my best to address this. But here in the US, it's a very different scenario in terms of I am an organizer who is not white and who speaks English with an accent and who is not tenured yet. I just applied for tenure. I haven't gotten my tenure yet. So because of all these vulnerabilities, oftentimes I'm an easy target by the university admin. It happened in the past that I was specifically targeted by the admin because of my union work, because of my Palestinian solidarity work. So I guess I navigated my cross-border experiences and fighting against different kinds of systems of oppression is an integral part of my feminist learning and feminist activism.
Thank you so much, Professor Nafisa, for your inspiring words.
Oh no, just call me Nafisa.
It sounds a little bit nice to call you Professor Nafisa. But yeah, Nafisa, Professor Nafisa, like, yes, I will honor your request. Okay, so you have been actively involved in feminist organizing, particularly with Meye Network and FAB, right? So can you tell us about the origins of these platforms and their impact on feminist activism?
Sure. So I was a member of the Meye Network. I was not one of the organizers, but I'm glad to say that I have seen this organization kind of flourishing like since 2011, and I have been able to observe, how the goals and the politics of this organization evolved over the years. So Meye started its journey back in 2011. It was an organic feminist platform. Like someone just added her Facebook friends, female friends, to just come together in a Facebook group and talk about uh, workplace experiences. So people were talking about how it's difficult for women to be a predominantly male-dominated workspaces, and what obstacles they face. And then they started talking about their personal lives, and to some extent, over the years, it became a space of storytelling and story sharing, and then extending support to each other. And at the same time, the network started extending its reach beyond that Facebook group. So there were a series of initiatives, including Rangta, that specifically work with female entrepreneurs. There was this initiative called Shundi that specifically, I think it probably started with after the Rana Plaza collapse, and Shundi was trying to support Rana Plaza survivors in the long run. And the goal was, there would be a huge availability of resources right after the collapse, but people would forget about the survivors in a year or two, and we wanted to be there when there won't be a lot of resources for those survivors. There was an initiative called Benami May where we created the space, and again, it was like long before when Facebook had this option of posting anonymously. So we created an anonymous account where people were able to share their stories and other people were able to support them. And in terms of how it evolved over the years, I would say, that's the beauty of doing feminist organizing. Just like the way my own definition of feminism transformed over the years, I would say, the Meye Network's feminism also transformed over the years. And, it's not a linear story. Not all members of Meye Network share the same kind of feminism. And sometimes we debate, sometimes we fight with each other, and sometimes we support each other. So I would say, at the end of the day, to some extent, it still has this, urban bias, urban middle class bias. Um, and we don't necessarily have, a lot of reach in the, minorities communities and the rural areas, but we're trying to create space for, whoever wants to join the network. It's an organic network, so it's not like, we don't have any formal membership fee or something. Not We don't have any registration process. So people just add their friends. If they feel like they share some kind of feminist value, we just add them. And in terms of feminist soul searching, I would say, specifically during the Shabag movement, I said at one point I felt like, as a transnational feminist scholar, this network used to be like hyper nationalist, in the sense that, oh, I hate everything about Pakistan. And to some extent, that ignores questions like, there are people in Pakistan who are very, very critical about the role of the state of Pakistan in 1971. And is there a way we can actually build solidarity with them? So at one point, I would say it was like hyper nationalist, but I think gradually kind of the mainstream tone changed. Just few years ago, I feel like there was, to some extent, some existentialist soul searching when, some organizers started to talk about, okay, whether we can actually like include trans women. It's a organization for May, like women. So anyone who identifies as women, that should include trans women. They should be a part of the group. And then we actually saw a series of, um, really, really transphobic comments. There were huge discussions about, whether a trans woman should be able to access, women's restroom. And like people were kind of divided. So I feel like it's going through a transition. It went through a transition. It's still growing through its transition. And the beauty of it is, as a network, we always welcome, new ideas and new practices and address our own biases. Like feminism is not a static thing. What feminism was 50 years ago has drastically changed. And as someone, who has been with the Meye Network since 2011, I would say that this network tries to kind of understand that, whenever we're working as feminist organizers, we need to be mindful about addressing our own biases and just recognize that, the definition of marginalized communities, the appearance of marginalized communities, minorities communities will change over time. And we need to kind of transform ourselves and kind of just create a nurturing and inclusive space for everyone. So yeah, that's about me. And Feminist Alliance of Bangladesh, I would say it's kind of an extension of the Meye Network, in a way that we're having conversations with, May organizers. And specifically after the July uprising last year, we felt like, um, we probably would need a space where, feminists can come together and just share their critiques and concerns about the state of Bangladesh. It kind of started with this very narrow focus on, July uprising and what would happen afterwards. And we just felt like, a lot of feminist conversations were explicitly focusing on the identity category. So it was about, women participated in organizing, but we don't see any women running the government. Like, how many female members are there in the female advisors are there in the government? And it was all about, okay, you just need powerful women at the top. And then we felt like that's not the kind of feminism we believe in. And feminism is, a movement against intersecting systems of oppression. And if you identify as a feminist, you should be able to criticize the state. You should be able to criticize, the dictatorial regime. You should be able to criticize the interim government. You should be able to criticize, the organizers as well, if you feel like they're not doing, something good. So, I mean, that was the thought process. And we wanted to focus on a decolonial feminist organizing, which means we challenge coloniality. And when I say coloniality, it's not just the history of colonization, but we challenge the intersecting nexus of oppressive systems. That means, this group would be critical about things like capitalism. This group would be critical about imperialism. We would be critical about, neoliberalism, heteropatriarchy, and things like that. And we would understand how intersections of these systems create and sustain conditions of vulnerability. So we wanted to reach out to people who identify as feminists and who are doing this kind of intersecting work at the grassroots. So we reached out to people who are doing this in Bangladesh. We reached out to people like me who are doing this outside of the country, and we wanted to curate the debates and discourses. So one of the initiatives that we took is we're trying to organize panels, just Zoom panels, and asking those questions to feminist organizers. And we're trying to curate, to some extent it's similar to the feminist archiving thing that Anna, you are also part of. So we're trying to curate those debates and discourses so that for future women's gender sexuality studies students and researchers and for anyone, if so that they can just go to YouTube and just access these critiques and just curate that there was an uprising that happened in 2024, and there were feminists who were involved about this, who had critical remarks about this, and who just didn't follow some kind of like, I don't know, very linear and oversimplified understanding of anti-fascist organizing. I mean, sometimes you can reproduce fascism in your anti-fascist organizing. So we tried to curate those conversations, debates, and discussion to some extent, create this archive of what feminists were thinking about the July uprising. It's a brand new project. I mean, right now we're extensively focusing on what's happening in Bangladesh right now, like what feminists are thinking in terms of the state of the government, whatever mob justice that's happening, hatred and violence against indigenous communities, religious and minorities communities, trans, queer, non-binary communities, women. So we are trying to bring those conversations within feminism. So a lot of people at the beginning will be like, oh, okay, so let's talk about feminist concerns to the interim government. So let's talk about, universal family code. Let's talk about, like addressing those reservations of CEDAW. Yes, we should be doing this. But what we believe that, feminism shouldn't be limited to, first of all, those like UN-based things and like the explicitly focusing on, the legalistic bureaucratic aspect of ensuring equity. It should be more than that. And in Bangladesh, as you know very well, right? I mean, feminist women have, I would say, had a very frustrating relationship with trans, queer, and non-binary organizing. And a lot of feminists, first of all, they are very hostile. And many might feel like, specifically like trans women are trying to intervene within the feminist spaces. And I must emphasize that this is not exclusively Bangladesh thing. I live in the US, and in the US, like transphobic feminism is a thing. It has a really long problematic history in the US and Europe as well, and it's happening in Bangladesh. And we're trying to create and nurture a feminist space where we build cross-border solidarity and cross-movement solidarity. So it's not just about, I'm going to talk about women's rights, but labor rights are women's rights. Palestine is a feminist issue. Workers, minimum wage movement is a feminist issue, and trans emancipation is a feminist issue. So we're trying to kind of expand the definition of feminism and trying to think about how we can first of all theorize and then strategize for cross movement solidarity building. So that is the goal of Feminist Alliance of Bangladesh. Very ambitious, and we just started our journey. We'll see how it turns out.
Thank you. You said like you don't want to be called Professor Nafisa, you want to be called just Nafisa, but it's really nice to like to call you Professor Nafisa. But yeah, Nafisa, thank you so much for the really, really great answer. I really enjoyed through it, and like it was so, articulate, and I'm so proud that like you all you folks are very much involved with doing this, organizing, and especially what Fab is right now doing is just, I would say, amazing. Thank you, Nafisa, for doing that. So my next question to you would be, in your experience, how do feminist movements in Bangladesh intersects with global feminist struggles, and what lessons can be exchanged between them?
Great question. And sometimes, as a feminist scholar from Bangladesh, I get those questions about, comparing like US feminism with Bangladeshi feminism, with the assumption that I was going to talk about, how Bangladesh is this backward country with lots of problems and women are oppressed versus how US kind of emancipates women. But I guess, in my super long, like professional feminist career and as a non-professional grassroots community organizer, to some extent, I think navigating the cross-border solidarities and, cross-border tensions actually made me realize that, um, feminist struggles are, first of all, unique. And interestingly, there are lots of overlaps. They're unique and there are overlaps. I mean, I can just talk about, my US and Bangladeshi experience, for example. In Bangladesh, you have worked in the, um, feminist and, like community organizing sector for a really long period of time. And as you know very well, it's really hard to survive without any kind of fund. I mean, we had to do, years and years of soul searching as part of Meye Network. There were debates and discussions about, okay, should we register as a nonprofit? And if we do, like what we're going to gain, what we're going to lose, does it mean that we wouldn't be able to criticize the state if we just, register as a nonprofit? And to some extent in the US, I guess feminists and all other kinds of social justice movements are also undergoing this existentialist crisis about how you negotiate the nonprofit industrial complex. Because when you organize, you need resources. And in the US, for example, most of the resources come from, corporations and big foundations. And most of the corporations and big foundations would give you the fund if they like your project, if they feel like you're advancing their vision. So at the end of the day, you end up working with the community and not prioritizing the needs of your community. It's always about, okay, what do I put in my grant application that's going to make my funders happy? And then you design a project that aligns with the goals and mission and visions of your funder. And to some extent, I would say that's a very common challenge in the Bangladeshi feminist organizing as well, and overall in social justice organizing, because I mean, it has become a 9 to 5 p.m. organizing. Feminism or any other kind of social justice organizing, you ask people to do it, and they'll be like, okay, how much money I'm gonna get? Like, what does the salary look like? When I was doing my PhD work, I was working with labor rights activists, grassroots labor rights activists who are not affiliated with nonprofit organizations, with NGOs. And a lot of them told me that these days it has become extremely difficult to organize workers. Like, you ask them to show up in a rally, they're going to ask you, are you going to pay for my bus fare? Am I going to get lunch? Am I going to get dinner? Am I going to get any compensation? And on one hand, yes, I mean, workers, it's hard for them to take a day off and show up at a protest, but also the activists were talking about, if you just can't commit yourself for a cause, maybe just show up in a rally on a weekend. And if you expect remuneration or compensation for your organizing work, it's just so demoralizing, and you can't go anywhere, because the moment you wouldn't be able to provide lunch, that means no one would show up in your rally. So I guess to some extent, this whole nonprofit industrial complex is not a local thing, it's a global thing, and it's affecting grassroots community organizing everywhere. And at the same time, I also want to talk about, the rise of the right-wing philosophies and practices across the world. In the US, Donald Trump assumed the presidency, and right after, becoming the president, he just passed a series of executive orders that explicitly targeted environmental protection. It targeted DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. It specifically targeted trans and queer and non-binary communities. And to some extent, if we look at Bangladesh, I mean, it's happening. I wouldn't say that Awami League was this guardian of secularism. I wouldn't say that, I mean, without Awami League, you can't really have a secular Bangladeshi society, because we have seen that our Awami League carefully nurtured its connection with Islamists and, to some extent, I don't want to generalize, but, orthodox, I would say, right-wing, conservative political, religion-based political parties very carefully. Like in 2018 election, most of the religion-based political groups were allied with Awami League. So it's interesting to kind of think about how Awami League kind of sustained the right wing to some extent, conservative and orthodox religious-based political organizing. And it's happening now. I mean, as we can see, I mean, there have been a series of attacks against religiously minorities communities and trans, queer, and non-binary communities. And people are coming from, like very orthodox interpretation of, whatever religion they follow. And it's all about, my religion is the best. And they're assuming control over, people's individual choices and individual practices. So I would say, this fight against, right-wing conservative philosophy that's, inspired, it's in some cases it's coming from, in the US, it's coming from, I would say, like, narrowly speaking, like Christian white supremacy. In Bangladesh, it's most of the cases, it's like Bengali Muslim men, cis men, who are trying to assume spaces everywhere. So it's not like similar. I guess the struggles are unique in different locations, but also it's connected. We can see a global pattern. There's a global nonprofit industrial complex that's making it extremely difficult to continue grassroots organizing. There have been a series of budget cuts in the US. Like, if you just go to the DC and talk to people who are working in the international development area, the government is trying to abolish USAID. I am critical about USAID for very different reasons, and it has a long history of kind of imposing, colonial assumptions through funding, colonial practices through funding. But the right-wing people, what we can do is we can try to make it better. The solution is never stopping USAID by saying that it's funding reproductive rights, so we're not going to pay for it. And in the US, for example, in DC, there have been massive, job losses and budget cuts because the USAID is gone. And at the same time, because the USAID is, that is gone technically, so many projects around the world that specifically were addressing things like, reproductive rights and access to, things like, abortion care, and they're supporting, different gender diverse communities. Now their work has been threatened. So I don't know. I just feel like the world is falling apart everywhere. And our struggles are very, very connected. Like, whatever is happening here, like, Donald Trump and, like, all these billionaires capturing the state power, it's going to affect feminist organizing in Bangladesh. And it's not just always a top-down thing. Sometimes, whatever happens in other parts of the world, it also, it affects what we experience here in the US. Our struggles are connected. So I guess our solidarity building should also be connected with each other. And without that, I don't think we have any hope.
Yeah, we desperately need hope, right? Like, it's going to be a very, very long few years, right? Coming to us. Yeah. I cannot start thinking about that. I just like, like I want to shut down that part of my brain and just pretend that like I just want to wake up and it's like this chaos is gone. Nafisa, thank you so much. So let's talk about your research right now. So my next question to you is that your research focuses on transnational, postcolonial, and decolonial feminisms. How do these theoretical frameworks shape the way you understand feminist activism in Bangladesh?
Sure. 1 second. I'm just gonna pull the curtain. I think
Oh,
it's much
absolutely.
better.
Sure.
Right, sure. So yeah, my work is very much inspired by a transnational and decolonial understanding of feminist theorization and organizing. And I guess what it teaches me is how I can challenge in the West, specifically the white neoliberal and Western version of feminism that hyper focuses on individual equality and doesn't question systemic oppression. There were feminist organizers, in the US. Um, for example, Sheryl Sandberg, it was about, many people would call it lean feminism. It's about, if you can climb up the corporate ladder, you will be a successful woman and then you will be an inspiration for everyone. So that's the model of feminism. And I guess transnational and decolonial feminist framework, teaches me that that's simply not enough. You need to challenge the system. You need to think about how this corporate capitalist neoliberal system shapes our experiences, every day, and how it deprives minorities communities and kind of sustains that state of depression forever. It also teaches me to connect feminist struggles. It's interesting that, just last year, specifically after the overturn of Roe v. Wade, a lot of feminist organizers, I would say mostly, white liberal feminist organizers, they started, obviously, I mean, for rightful reasons, they started organizing against it. And many of them uncritically just celebrated, the Biden administration for upholding, reproductive freedom. Reproductive freedom became this catchy word in the Biden campaign. And they were all about, if you elect us, we're going to ensure reproductive freedom. But what Palestinian feminist organizers actually taught us that, on one hand, this Biden administration in the US, they're talking about reproductive freedom. On the other hand, in Palestine, they are perpetuating a condition of reproductive genocide by funding these, like Israel's genocide against Palestinians and specifically, women identified people. And there are Palestinian feminists who should demonstrate that how there were so many pregnant people in Palestine who had to go through C-section surgeries without anesthesia. There were numerous pregnancy losses, just because of the stress and, the psychological and physical stress it put on pregnant people. And when you think about, reproduction here in the US, in many cases, it's about, access to abortion, access to prenatal and postnatal care, and this very narrow focus on, reproductive health. But Palestinian feminist organizers are teaching us that when we talk about reproduction, it's not just about, access to abortion, access to IVF. It's about, nurturing the life-giving and life-sustaining capacities. So that means, freedom from oppression. That includes, freedom from mass incarceration, freedom from capitalist oppression, freedom from, colonial intervention, freedom from everyday violence. And I feel like that feminist framework, that decolonial feminist framework, is like super absent in the US, and it's also completely, to some extent, if not completely, this is not the mainstream feminism in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, when we talk about, if we don't necessarily talk about reproductive, slow reproductive genocide. I mean, the way, environmental protections are to some extent non-existent in Dhaka. Like when you breathe air, you're slowly kind of breathing in poison. That is a feminist issue, and feminists should be organizing around that. And what's happening in Bangladesh is most of the feminist organizations, because of various reasons, they had to register as NGOs, which means that they wouldn't be able to participate in any civil disobedience. That means they wouldn't be able to criticize the government. They are not allowed to create any troubles. So I guess this decolonial feminist organization is shrinking every day. And it's just so important for us to move on with that kind of feminist thinking, because it raises critical questions about, first of all, who produces theory? Why did I only only learn about Western feminist organizers, Western feminist thinkers in my Bangladeshi women gender sexuality studies class back in, like 2003 and 2004. And mind it, we even didn't call it sexuality studies. We only focus on women and later gender. So like, why was I able to finish my undergrad women and gender studies degree without talking about non-binary and queer identities? I mean, like even a single time. I mean, that was not mentioned ever in my 4 years of undergrad training in Bangladesh. So I guess what decolonial and transnational feminist frameworks do, it challenges that kind of knowledge production. Like, how can you do feminism? How you can produce feminist knowledge, like without talking about non-binary experience? It raises questions about, the politics of funding, like how Planned Parenthood is supporting, abortion care and reproductive health care in the US. But this is the very organization which took a very two-sided approach during the Israeli genocide on Palestine. They issued a statement where they said that, oh, we condemn Hamas. But then they started talking about Palestinian struggle, but there was no subject. They never mentioned that we condemn Israel for inflicting violence. So why does it happen? Thinking about funding politics, and also, who can do transnational organizing? I mean, to be able to connect with, transnational solidarity building initiatives. And this is something I did during my PhD fieldwork, was we are seeing some labor organizers are becoming, transnational superstars, speaking for garment workers everywhere. But then there were other grassroots labor rights organizers who don't speak English, who don't accept international funding, and no one knows them. Like, they don't have YouTube channels, they don't give interviews, they don't travel US and Europe like very often, but they're doing important work on the ground. So I guess the transnational decolonial framework that I adopt in my work, on one hand, it questions the intersecting systems of oppression It questions the politics of knowledge production. It questions the politics of funding when we are doing transnational community organizing. And also, it raises critical questions about ourselves, like who are we? What privileges and vulnerabilities do we have? And how we can be accountable to the communities we're working with.
Thank you so much, Nafisa. Um, my next question to you is that, so as someone who teaches and writes about feminism, what are the gaps you see in how feminist knowledge is produced and circulated, and how can we challenge these exclusions?
That's a great question. And I guess I can talk about, both the Bangladesh perspective and the US perspective. And like I said, I mean, it's sometimes feels funny, to work in two different countries, but then seeing, the unique struggles as well as the overlaps. So in Bangladesh, I would say, I mean, as someone who teaches about feminism and who, researches on feminism, I feel like um, intersectional feminism is not something that we are great at. And for a really long period of time, where are the feminist organizations? In the Gulshan, Bonani area, it's mostly, like middle class or upper middle class, Muslim majority, women identified people who ran all the feminist NGOs. And I'm explicitly talking about the NGOs that were able to secure huge amount of funding. So that used to be the primary mood of feminism. To some extent, that is still the primary mood of, feminist organizing in Bangladesh. And we need to problematize this. We need to focus on, the radical grassroots community organizing. And to some extent, we don't have to invent it. We have a long history of, even the leftists, to some extent, communist organizing. You can criticize it for all sorts of reasons. It was like hyper male focused. And to some extent, they looked at Russia and China as this, ideal imperial parent, and didn't necessarily think about, like local context and adapting to the needs. But we have a long history of grassroots community organizing. I mean, it was flawed, but it was there in this country. Voluntary organizing, to some extent, professionalizing of feminism. It kind of started, back in the late 80s and 90s, and it has become, the prevalent form. And I feel like we need to question it. And what makes me hopeful is among the young generation, like people like you. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of, interest about, going back to this community organizing model, right? I mean, yes, and you need a full-time job and you need to pay your bills, but also, just the way you're doing this interview on a weekend, right? I mean, no one is paying you and you're, putting your emotional labor in it. And I feel like that is basically, the means to achieve a radical feminist future, that we need to come out of this NGOized and professionalized model of feminist organizing and just build grassroots coalitions, right? I mean, the way you're asking me questions about, Meye and, Feminist Alliance in Bangladesh, and the collaborations that you are doing, and specifically, this young generation, you are not necessarily carrying, the baggage the older generation is carrying. And also, I feel like you're also very open to expanding the definition of feminism. You are not going back to the same question of, okay, you're not counting the number of female advisory committee members, but you are asking really critical questions about, okay, so I mean, all this, like I don't know, like trans and queer communities are being attacked. Like, why is the interim government not doing anything, right? And I feel like this system analysis, the young generation, and young people like you, I mean, you are addressing that analysis. I just hope that it spreads more and more, and the mainstream powerful organizations who still control funding and who dominate feminist spaces, I hope that it adapts at some point. Um, and in the US, I would say, as someone, who's kind of embedded in like two different contexts, to some extent, yes, I mean, our work is also getting extremely challenging on one hand because of the Trump administration. And I feel like now we are kind of going back to the basics, right? I mean, I am someone who's very critical about, the liberal feminist politics. I am the one who talk about abortion rights are not enough because, you need to think about how US as the imperial state, for example, in Puerto Rico, they enforced ligation on Puerto Rican women because they wanted to basically, to it could be, you could call it, to some extent, a slow genocidal approach where you're trying to kind of erase the local communities. And even California, like in um, very recently, I mean, they were forcing incarcerated women to undergo ligation. So it's not just about you should have abortion rights, but you should have reproductive justice where you're able to choose how you're going to use your body, how you're going to enjoy pleasure, and with whom or without anyone, how you want to do it. It should be your call, right? So I'm someone who kind of talks about reproductive justice. I try to say that, oh, you know what, supporting abortion is not enough, but I feel like I'm kind of going back to the basics now. I'm like, okay, so they're basically saying that you can't talk about, DEI. So, I mean, I have to go back to my very liberal definition of feminism. I'm like, no, we should talk about women. So I don't know, it makes me very frustrating. But also when I look at my students, the young generation, I just feel like they're full of hope. They have open minds. And just last year we saw, all these young people, they've made connection with their experiences with what was happening in Palestine, right? All the encampment movement that happened across US campuses. Like, okay, why would you care? And to some extent, many of us think that this new generation, they're just self-contained and they don't care about anyone else. But they're caring so much about, an institutional genocide that was being inflicted on a community far away from the US. And they were spending days and nights of in community organizing. They're getting arrested. They got hurt by police and, Zionist people, and still, I mean, they just, they stick to their ethics. So I feel like, I don't know, I just feel like young generation in Bangladesh, in the US, all across the world, they give me hope. And I hope that, I mean, they nurture an intersectional feminist values and they implement this, in whatever they do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nafisa. As you like, that is something like, not that is something caught my attention is that you're talking about, Gulshan-based feminism, right? Like very, very middle class, upper middle class, Gulshan-centric. What are the other words again? Yeah, it's very much like, based on that. So we do have our criticism about like how feminism work, and we also kind of like, like have our shared like opinions, how Bangladeshi feminist movement, even also like spaces can be pretty, queer and also trans exclusionary, right? And how it can be feel like, okay, fine, we are just tokenize some people who are kind of like, a little bit feminized, right? Like who looks like, the traditional feminist, the woman feminist, right? So that's how they can be included in those spaces, but excluding, the non-binary or the queer people, right? Because they do not look like that particular, the definition of, I would say, woman. So you have to be a woman in a feminist movement in Bangladesh. That is the one thing I'm very sad that like I have to witness this. And really do think like it's better right now because I have gained a little bit certain power from maybe academia or maybe my kind of like gender diverse community engagement. But it's very sad, like a lot of folks come to me and saying that like why we should embrace intersectional feminism if there is the mainstream feminists or the mainstream feminist movement just use us as their tokenist, I would say, methodology, but in behind the doors, they have their meetings with the so-called biological, like I would say, identified women, and they just make fun of us, right? I do agree that like there's so much fragmentations in each and every community. Don't you think like in feminist community there are like people bitching about people, or like they're just trying to like to, having their personal problems. It happens. Yeah, there's some like hijab people, trans people, queer people. They do have their own kind of like politics about like, doing stuff or activism. But kind of like labeling these people as like, oh, these people are really problematic, or like they make too much noise, right? Or like they kind of like, all the time they're just fighting with each other. Um, so I really, really do thank you to like to as a feminist to like to kind of address that like how exclusionary can be and tokenized. And also it's very, very sad. Like at the end of the day, we say intersectionality, but at the end of the day, indigenous feminists have to like to fight them for themselves. Queer feminists have to like to fight for themselves. It's more likely that. Okay, so it's far from intersectional. Like, maybe we're making pledges about like, oh, we want to do that, but at the end of the day, whenever things happen, it's just like, if you're in that particular box, you have to worry about that particular box. Sorry for my lengthy, I would say, response to you. Nafisa, so this is why my question for you, the next question to you is that, so what do you see as that the most pressing challenges facing feminist movements in Bangladesh today?
In Bangladesh, I would say, broadly speaking, um, and again, I mean, if you ask me to identify the most pressing challenges, I mean, I would be generalizing, right? I mean, there are people who are kind of, working outside of the mainstream and doing amazing work. But if you ask me about the mainstream feminist organizing, I would say there's this significant gap of what I would call system thinking. And to some extent, we're just still kind of hooked up with this idea of, achieving elusive equality with like Bengali Muslim cis men. And if you can be like them, everything will be fine. So I feel like all these feminist organizations have been doing amazing work, but like how can you connect your feminist struggles with critiques of neoliberalism, critiques of imperialism, critiques of capitalism? And I'm saying this as someone who have studied labor organizing and specifically garment labor organizing in Bangladesh for years. I started my work in 2013 and still continuing that work. And I've seen that, labor organizing and specifically organizing that happens around issues like raising minimum wage. There's very little, quote unquote, feminist solidarity with that initiative because technically, that's a labor rights issue and we don't do labor rights. And how can you not do labor rights, right? When, at least like 60% people working in the industry, they identify as, cis women. So I feel like to some extent when we do feminist work and specifically human rights work, we try to put this rights into different boxes, right? Oh, I do environmental rights. I'm not going to do women's rights. I do women's rights. I'm not going to do labor rights. I do queer rights. Feminists are going to hate me. So it has become a problem. And instead of, like putting those different rights into different boxes, it's really important for us to think about how those rights are connected. You can't really separate, labor rights from feminist rights, specifically when we're talking about an industry which is heavily feminized. And I'm not just saying that, there are women workers. It's a heavily feminized industry where they cheapen your labor. So I feel like system thinking, lack of system thinking is a huge challenge. Lack of cross movement solidarity is another challenge. And to some extent, we are, because of the long history of, state sponsored dictatorships that happened in the past, I feel like a lot of people are kind of accustomed to do safe organizing and safe feminism, right? To some extent, I mean, and even I feel like that safe feminism is also falling apart, right? When I was doing my work, I remember one of my informants, she worked at a big international development organization, and she actually told me that, as non-profit or NGO worker, it was easy to address some of the things like, education. That's a state issue, right? Who is going to talk against education other than, extreme conservative mullahs? Like most of the liberal people will be happy if you just talk about education, right? Malala Yousafzai, I mean, she is this globally popular, character, this global sweetheart who talks about education and who talks about, liberating Pakistani women without being highly critical about the long history of imperialism, US invasion, and everything that's happening in Pakistan. And even when she says that, mainstream media conveniently erases that quote. And in Bangladesh, I feel like a lot of feminist organizing is happening as long as it's safe, right? You can talk about education, and you can talk about things like, like Ballo Vivaho, early marriage. Like I said, I mean, you only get like mullahs fighting against it. And I would say the scenario has changed. I mean, even when you talk about education, even when you talk about, like updating something like, the national curriculum, you are being targeted because there was someone who incorporated a story that talked about gender fluidity, and then you become a target by like right-wing orthodox people. So I don't know, I mean, I think it's a very hostile situation for doing radical organizing work. It's to some extent, it was never friendly, and I mean it's becoming, I guess, more and more hostile. And I think navigating, I mean, I already talked about the nonprofit industrial complex, the way it has almost become a norm that if you want to do something, you'll have to start an organization, and then you either register as a nonprofit or a foundation. You bring big grants, and you only write about those grants, that make your funders happy. So previously, if you just submitted a grant for HIV funding, you get your grant. And then after, the attack in Gulshan, the Holy Artisan attack, I mean, there was this, series of grants that came to address religious fundamentalism in Bangladesh. So most of the NGOs are like, oh, now we need to craft something. And recently, you just talked about, tokenistic inclusion of trans, queer, non-binary people. And recently, to some extent, I mean, there are many funders who are not just happy if you just say that we're going to empower women. They want to hear more. So you write about, we are going to ensure, gender diversity, and we are going to ensure that, diverse sexualities are respected, da, da, da. We are going to empower these people. So you're basically like using, first of all, I mean, these are vague languages. It doesn't necessarily describe really like material grassroots struggles that those non-binary communities go through. And many organizations are just using those vague terms to make sure that they get the funding and they can operate. And there you see the tokenistic representation and tokenistic inclusion of trans, queer, and non-binary communities. So yeah, I mean, there are just so many challenges, and I guess it's really easy to get demoralized. But also then I would go back to grassroots organizing and the amazing work people like you have been doing. And I guess I don't think we are going to be saved by the mainstream NGOized cis women centric feminist organizing in Bangladesh. They can't save us. And if someone can give us hope, it's the new generation. I mean, obviously, I mean, I wouldn't just discredit the long history of feminist organizing in Bangladesh. Like when, say, for example, in 1988, I think, when Islam was declared as the state religion. In that context, there were feminist organizers who went to the street and who raised voices. And those brave organizing, brave kinds of organizing have happened again and again and again. And many of those feminists, they didn't get paid. Like there won't be any funder who's gonna, pay you to kind of go against the state. I mean, they want you to do something safe. But a lot of feminists did it. I mean, they have a long history of doing this. So I guess, if the young generation kind of takes lesson, not necessarily from the highly NGOized, legalistic, bureaucratic feminism, but if they can, get inspiration from the long history of grassroots community organizing, and I'm saying community organizing, not just feminist organizing, and learn lessons and then implement it in their own grassroots organizing, I guess that can give us hope.
Thank you, Nafisa. So I think my concluding question for you would be, to you is that reflecting on your journey so far, what are some of the key lessons you have learned as a feminist organizer and scholar? your this is the, you know, l- not a last question, but one of the last questions for you. Okay.
Oh, I guess one of the key lessons that I have picked up is, you have to organize against intersecting systems of oppression. I always mention a quote by Audre Lorde: there is no hierarchy of struggles, right? I mean, just because I'm a feminist doesn't mean that, oh, I only care about women and I don't care about, like trans people. No, that's not a feminism. Um, and there are feminist values that you need to commit to, right? To me, I mean, I can't be a feminist and then saying that if we get a female president in the United States, then everything is fine. Or I mean, in International Women's Day celebration, you would see that big female corporate CEOs are invited to inspire the new generation of women, as if if you just get female CEOs in Bangladesh, everything will be solved. So I guess it's one of the key lessons I have learned over the years, that we need to go beyond this tokenistic, individualistic way of addressing feminism, and we need to organize against intersecting systems of oppression. And that's a hard thing to do, and sometimes that's a vague thing to do. Like, what is intersecting systems of oppression? It just means that whenever you see injustice, you need to speak up. And if you're a feminist and if you see that indigenous communities are facing violence, then someone just beating them up because they claim to be identified as Adivashi. I mean, no matter if whether your organization only works with women, you need to speak up. So I guess that is the kind of feminist values and practices that at least and I try my best to uphold in my work and organizing. And the other thing I've learned, that we have to be accountable to the communities we work with. We can't just claim that just because I mean, I have a PhD, I'm a college professor, like I know everything about feminism. I go to my classrooms and I learn every day from my students. And again, I mean, I'm old, like I'm like 40. And I mean, I don't know like how the social media works. I'm not familiar with the most updated media. And also, I mean, I'm not someone, who's kind of navigating, puberty, or, I don't know, like navigating, relationships, intimacy, or, like, okay, how do I pay college tuition? I mean, I've left that part of my life. So I think it's really important for us to kind of to have an open mind and not just think that just because I have done this work for whatever number of years, I know everything. We never know everything. um, Maybe we have a lot of experiences, but every day we are fighting new uncertainties, new situations that we are not exposed to before. So it's really important for us, first of all, to have an open mind and to maintain a mindset of where, we can learn from people who are young, who may not have that many experiences, but who have fresh perspectives. They are not carrying, our baggages. And they're hopeful. Many of us, who are kind of like approaching the middle age or, like older, they're like, okay, nothing works. I've spent my life fighting this and it doesn't work. So I'm giving up hope. But like young people, they're just full of hope. And I just feel like it's really important for us, to kind of nurture that fresh energy and create space for them, not just to occupy spaces as, like, okay, big name feminist hotshots, but actually like create space for young people. And then be very, very accountable about what we do and very mindful about our own privileges and vulnerabilities. Like when I'm saying something, I mean, I have never worked at a garment factory. Can I speak for a garment worker? Hell no. Maybe I know a lot about, organizing, but I don't know like how it feels to be at a garment factory without proper ventilation and having to work for 14 hours. I don't know that. So I think that humbleness, that recognition that, there are unknowns and there are things, maybe I can be a partner in organizing, but I can't speak for you. So I think it's one of the key things that I've learned, that we need to learn how to work with communities and not necessarily work for communities.
Thank you so much, Nafisa. My now last question for you is that, so finally, okay, yes. Finally, is there a particular story or experience that encapsulates the essence of your feminist journey, something that has stayed with you over the years?
Um, That's a great question. Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like, my life is just full of stories. And really, I mean, yeah, I don't think I can give you one specific story, but I think, I really value sometimes, and I think it's a painful experience that I sometimes I feel like I belong nowhere, right? I grew up in Bangladesh and now I live in a very different country. Um, and in this country, I just stand out. Like wherever I go, there are very few people who speak English in my accent and who look like me. And to some extent, I have this, I don't know, this perpetual crisis about belongingness. Even and now when I go to Bangladesh, I'm like, a lot of things actually don't make sense because I've developed a very, new perspective. I have become a different people. But also I feel like, if you ask me about a story, I guess the story of, crossing borders, on one hand, it's a very painful journey. On the other hand, I just feel like it enriched me so much. I would never be the person I have become if I just stayed in, you know, I don't know, in Dhaka, and this is not to say anything about, like I had a tremendous amount of, privilege to be able to, come out of the country and, attend like schools in North America. I am mindful about that privilege part, but I feel like, I just feel like I have become a very different kind of person, like because, I have that privilege of, crossing um, borders. I can go back and forth. On one hand, I'm mindful about the privilege that, I mean, I have a passport that allows me to do it. I have, like proper documentations and, I have the resources to be able to do that. But on the other hand, I would say that, this border crossing experience, I just feel like it gives me a lot of perspectives that I would never be able to realize if I just lived my life as, an upper middle class, like Bengali Muslim college professor at a prestigious university in Dhaka. Again, no offense about that, but I just feel like my embodied experience has become a lot more enriched because of the very personal struggles I had to go through as an immigrant Muslim identified woman of color in North America. So I value that.
Thank you, Nafisa. That's it. Okay, Nafisa, thank you so much for sharing your journey, your insights, and your vision with us today. Your work as a scholar and organizer bridges feminist theory and activism in a way that inspires so many of us. As part of the Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project, your voice will be a valuable resource for future generations seeking to understand and carry forward feminist movements. Thank you so much for everyone who have joined us for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bangladesh Feminist Archives YouTube channel for future episodes. Stay tuned for more stories from feminists shaping Bangladesh history and future. Thank you again, Nafisa, and thank you all for being part of this journey.